Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am George from Ireland, and today I'm going to tell you about the rise of fascism in Italy for the purpose of A-level. So we should begin by looking at Italy in 1918. The First World War had just ended. Italy had sustained 800,000 deaths in 3 years of fighting and gained only a tiny amount of territory. In 1915, Italy had entered the war because of the Treaty of London, a secret treaty whereby France and the United Kingdom had promised Italy very extensive gains at the expense of Austria-Hungary in the event of victory. The Italians felt cheated because they'd only been given a small portion of what they'd been assured that they would gain. So Italians often talked about the mutilated victory. However, Italy did agree to all this at the Treaty of Saint-Germain between the Allies and Austria, or indeed Trianon, which is the Allies, and Hungary at the end of the First World War. So Italy had suffered horrendously, partly through the deaths, but also the economic disruption, the great hardship engendered by the war. Italy had a liberal constitution, and all men could vote. Italy was mostly a literate country, so that had changed. Il Risorgimento, the unification, was still within living memory. Local identities were still fairly strong. There was a tension between that and nationalist feeling that Italy should be united. Italy was ruled by a royal family, the House of Savoy. It was King Victor Emmanuel, or Vittorio Emanuele, to give him his Italian name. The capital was Rome, of course. The Russian Revolution had just occurred in 1917, so communists had seized power in Russia. Some Italians were inspired by this, felt there should be a communist government in Italy, whereby the working class would seize control of factories, banks, railway stations, farms, and so on. Things would be owned in common, that's why it's called communist, and run for the common good. No longer private property and profit for the rich, it should be to benefit the poor. Now, Milan was the most industrial city in Italy, second largest city in the country. It was a hotbed of far-left political activity. Communists and other socialists and anarchists were very active. They seized control of many factories there. So Italy was almost in a state of turmoil just after 1918. A lot of soldiers returned from the war. Many of them found themselves unemployed. So there was great fury, hardship, disillusionment. It was not just in Italy. This was a Europe-wide phenomenon. Another thing is, the only thing that Italy produced in huge numbers in the First World War was guns. The country was awash in guns, so it's very easy for political factions and criminals to get a hold of firearms. The crucial personality in all this is Benito Mussolini. So he was born in 1881 in Predappio, a village in northern Italy. You can still see the house he was born in and indeed his tomb there. He'd been a primary school teacher. He'd lived abroad in Switzerland. He'd been a socialist. He'd edited a socialist newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia. He said he was an anti-patriot and he was anti-clerical, which is to say he disliked the Catholic Church, despite almost all Italians being at least nominal members of the Catholic Church. He then switched completely to being pro-war, to agitating for Italy to enter the First World War on the Allied side, which had happened. He'd fought in that war. He'd been wounded by his own grenade. He became an extreme nationalist and flagrant racist, saying that Italians were superior to all other ethnicities and whites generally were better than other races. Of course, it's a completely specious and revolting attitude, but that was his belief. Despite being supposedly anti-socialist, he did have some socialist opinions about common ownership of property, a very strong state. He didn't like civil liberties such as freedom of expression and fair elections or fair trials. He admitted having some regard for Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, who was a communist, and Lenin had said that if anyone can effect a socialist revolution in Italy, it's Mussolini. So Mussolini had formed his Fascisti di Combattimento just after the First World War, and they didn't really seem to know what they believed, but they hired themselves out as gangs of toughs for factory owners and other various wealthy people to fight off communists, to prevent communists seizing their property. These fascisti, they had bosses of their gangs called Ras. Italy had some overseas colonies, Eritrea, part of Somalia. They bordered Ethiopia, and in Ethiopia a ras is a duke, it's like a noble title. That's why the fascisti called their gang leaders a ras. They talked about trencherismo, trenchism, because many of them had been soldiers in the First World War fighting in trenches, and it was this sense of comradeship and dislocation. They couldn't readjust to civilian life, and they felt some sense of purpose and identity going around in gangs of thugs, often carrying a manganello, which is a club to hit people over the head. They would grab socialists, beat them up, force them to drink castor oil. They started wearing black shirts, the fascists, that is. The word is derived from a bundle of rods in Latin. In ancient Rome, lictors, who were judges, would carry a bundle of rods with an axe in the middle. A bundle of rods because one rod can be taken out and snapped very easily, but as a bundle they can't be broken because unity is strength. And the axe to symbolize only the state has the rightful power to put you to death. The fascists were looking back to Italy's most glorious chapter, which was ancient Rome. Let me see. So another important thing to realize is, as I say, most Italians were Catholics, at least in name, although not all of them were very observant. And the fascists said, oh, the church should have no role, it's corrupt, it's international, we don't really like it, which limited their appeal. The Pope had not approved of Italy being united because he'd lost a lot of territory. The Pope still controlled a few buildings in the centre of Rome. The Pope was nicknamed the prisoner in the Vatican because he refused to recognise the Italian state and go out. Many people are capable of doublethink, calling themselves faithful Catholics, going to church every Sunday, keeping the sacraments, but at the same time going against the Pope's preachments when he said the Italian state is illegitimate. And of course the Catholic Church was capable of doublethink, still appointing chaplains to the Italian army and ministering to Italian politicians who set up this Kingdom of Italy. So we talk about this era in Italy as liberal Italy, when it had a liberal constitution, when by this stage all men were allowed to vote and they had free elections. They weren't entirely fair, there was considerable cheating, they had freedom of expression. But liberal Italy was thought to be feeble. There was a lot of bribe taking, there was a lot of nepotism, which is to say people being promoted to public offices because of who their friends and relatives were, not on the basis of capability. The mafia in the south was predominant. The government was not effective in clamping down on them. Many people in Sicily felt that Italy was a foreign country. They still spoke their Sicilian dialect, and they didn't care about the government in Rome very much. Having said that, the Prime Minister until 1919, Vittorio Orlando, was a Sicilian. Because Italy hadn't been granted sufficient territory at the end of the First World War, a man called Gabriella de Nunzio, who was a fascist leader, he led some of his followers into Istria, which we'd call Fiume, on the coast of what's now Croatia, and simply seized the town. Under half of the people in the town were ethnic Italians, but nevertheless he just claimed it for himself, and this was against international law. The Italian government had great difficulty getting to leave. It might have come to blows. Anyway, eventually he did have to rescind that territory, but he was a hero to many in Italy, and he exposed the weakness of the Italian government for not doing that. So D'Annunzio was capable of all sorts of operatics, loved posing as someone who was heroic. He composed rather ridiculous poetry about drinking tea from the lips of his beloved, but he was the kind of person who Mussolini really liked. So the situation got worse and worse. The fascists did get some people elected to the Italian parliament. The communists were also rising. Many people were worried about that. There was a lot of political violence. Italy was close to civil war, so there were hundreds of political assassinations at this time, about half of them committed by fascists. People who'd previously been liberals or conservatives began to think that they had to support the fascists, despite the fascists being loutish, because the fascists were the only ones brutal enough to stop communists taking over. And people were aware of just how horrendous things were in communist Russia, with a very oppressive government which had deliberately killed hundreds of thousands of its people and was starving many of them to death. Many Russians had fled abroad, spreading these tales of horror under communism, which had also abolished Christianity. So Mussolini suggested he'd have a march on Rome, and he was simply going to seize power. But that's all there is time for in this video. I'll explain what happened with the march on Rome next time.